Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault in Lviv, Ukraine. All that talk of a pause, maybe a ceasefire, forget it. A maternity hospital full of vulnerable people was hit by airstrikes today, and all the aid you see around you, it's still not getting to the most precarious places where people are cold, hungry, trapped in basements while war rages outside. Ukraine's needs are urgent. Here's what's happening tonight. Hundreds of thousands stuck inside Mariupol as the world calls for the shelling to stop.
Hospitals, healthcare workers, none of these should ever be a target.
Plus concern as the power goes out at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. So you're basically just screaming at the world to pay attention here.
Yes, it seems like everybody is aware, but nobody is doing anything.
I'm Andrew Chang. Also tonight, the ripples of war felt here.
Can I ask you a simple question that is not a simple question? How are you?
We don't have time to think about how we are.
And an incredible discovery 3,000 meters below.
The state of preservation is just something unbelievable.
A story of endurance. This is The National.
A maternity hospital in Mariupol has become another terrible milestone in the escalating brutality of the war in Ukraine. Part of it obliterated by an airstrike, just as more Ukrainians trapped in the fighting are faced with three stark options: fight, survive, or if you can, escape. Thousands of evacuees have made it out through humanitarian corridors from Kyiv, Sumy, and other cities. The UN says it has confirmed that at least 500 civilians have died so far in the war, acknowledging the true toll likely far higher. Hard to count in Mariupol, a city surrounded and starved, relentlessly bombed. The hospital blast alone reportedly wounding 17. Margaret Evans shows us it is an ugly pattern we have seen before.
Hard to tell at first whether it's snow or ash falling in the aftermath of what Ukraine says was a Russian attack on a maternity and children's hospital in the city of Mariupol. Video posted on social media shows a huge crater where the missile hit. Russia continues to insist it is not targeting civilians, but it's not the first time Moscow has been accused of deliberately hitting hospitals in a conflict like Syria.
None of these should ever be a target.
A ceasefire was to have been in place in Mariupol and other cities where civilians are trapped.
Mariupol is under continuous shelling from the artillery and bombing. Each hour, each minute, each second.
Some of the proposed safe corridors were more successful in other parts of the country. People here making it out of Irpin, close to the capital, Kyiv, albeit in treacherous conditions and with long journeys and uncertainty still ahead. Far to the west in Lviv, Ukraine's cultural heartland, streets seem crowded with tourists at first glance. But the refugees, the internally displaced, the city is already at capacity. But they're still preparing for more. There's no shortage of fighting spirit here. This day marks the birthday of Ukraine's great writer and national symbol, Taras Shevchenko, a chronicler of Russian oppression in the 1800s. Authorities here have actually discouraged people from gathering in public during wartime. But clearly today of all days, during this time of all times, people couldn't stay away. There are signs that the city, if not yet the people, expect the war to extend its reach even here. In her 70s, Marty Hrinda admits she's nervous. I feel that we will prevail, she says. Ukraine and our nation cannot be defeated. But it's already being damaged, irreparably so. Lives lost and torn apart. And while many here believe victory will come for Ukraine, they'll also tell you it's impossible to make out just how long it might take to achieve. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Lviv.
There are new concerns about what might be happening at two nuclear power plants under Russian control. The UN nuclear watchdog says it has stopped getting readings from two nuclear power plants in Ukraine seized by Russia, one in Zaporizhia in the south and the infamous Chernobyl nuclear plant, site of that disaster in 1986. Chernobyl seems to have lost electricity needed to keep its nuclear fuel cooled. It's currently on backup generators, and that leaves one woman with deep connections to the plant deeply concerned.
So this is the video from the first hour of invasion by Russian troops.
This is Valentina, and let's leave it at Valentina because she's worried. That video, taken moments after the Chernobyl nuclear plant was invaded by Russian troops in February. Look at those tanks. Its workers held hostage inside, including, she says, her dad. He's been staying in touch ever since, calling out. What was your dad saying to your mom in terms of what he was worried about in particular?
In particular, first of all, they're just simply starving and exhausted. It's what about a health state and mental state of the staff. Maybe you've heard one of the employees just ran away, and he was the leading operator at actually this storage of spent fuel. For the last days, my mom received information from my dad by landline, but now it's cut down and we can't contact him anymore. And the latest thing he said that the electricity shut down.
You hear Chernobyl and most think of the catastrophe of 1986 and the explosion. That the still precarious site is now in Russian hands is a problem. There's calm and caution from nuclear agencies. They seem to believe the Russians want the work to continue. But Valentina isn't as confident. Her nerves aren't just because it's her dad trapped there.
I'm talking right now as a physicist, and my grandpa has started this nuclear plant. There could be a risk of explosion. And my mom is engineer at nuclear plant. They know something about how this plant, how these storages, how they work, how they run. And my dad said that even after they switched on these emergency generators, the temperature of the water in these pools, it's already much higher than the normal one.
She's been begging the IAEA to ensure the generators still have fuel, the electricity is restored, the workers protected. She's not sure it's happening or that her father will be okay.
That's just real unpredictable right now.
So you're basically just screaming at the world to pay attention here.
Yes, I mean, I've been screaming to the world like for the last 2 weeks.
Displaced, frightened, but focused on getting the message out that war's toll is more dangerous by the day. And so remember, this is just one story about one nuclear power plant. There is another one in the south, also under Russian control. It isn't transmitting readings either. This is a really important one to keep an eye on.
Right, just one unique worry as more of the country becomes a battlefield. We're going to take you through right now what we know of the fighting today. When we look at the war on the ground, it's natural to focus on major cities, right? So you have Kiev in the north, Kharkiv in the northeast. You're going to see Odessa appear on this map in the southwest. Cities that, if they fall, could alter the course of the war. But their fate, in turn, hinges on smaller battles happening right now. On paper, firepower is Russia's great strength. And Russia certainly looks poised to enter Kiev, but its advance from the east faces a problem. Chernihiv and Sumy, a pair of cities each about the size of Saskatoon, are still holding. Going around them leaves Russia's supply lines exposed. Because they are a threat, they are under threat. The Russian bombardment, punishing. And it's the same for Izium and Mykolaiv. Reports and unverified video suggest the fight for them is fierce. Izium is a town of just 45,000 people, now a key part of Ukraine's defense in the east. And in the south, Russian forces have been moving past Mykolaiv, but can't easily push towards the strategic port of Odessa. Move too quickly, fail to protect supply lines, and the campaign literally runs out of gas, leaving hardware abandoned and looted. But moving too slowly gives Ukraine time to train recruits and deploy Western-supplied weapons.
In particular, anti-armor and air defense.
And those weapons are already turning Russia's strength into a target. Eventually, Russia could take some of those smaller cities, pushing the Ukrainian forces and fleeing civilians westward. That would displace even more people. The UN estimates as many as 5 million could flee the country.
Indeed, and they are heading to countries all across Europe. But it's not just Ukrainians who are on the move. There are also hundreds of others escaping oppression in Russia. Helsinki has become a magnet for some of those refugees. Salima Shivji caught up with a few of them.
Helsinki Central train station, proudly flying the colors of Ukraine. Just inside, train after train rolls in, 2 a day. A steady stream of Russian nationals making the journey from St. Petersburg. This young student shows me what was closing in on her back home. Small signs of protest up against symbols of support for Russian troops advancing on Ukrainian cities. I was having panic attacks, she says. I had to get out. Many of my friends are leaving too. She's unsure when or even if she'll go back to Russia. For the past week, Helsinki-bound trains reserved for Russian and Finnish nationals have had barely a seat available.
The trains are full, both trains, so it's about like 700 people, a little bit less per day.
A few blocks away, the bus terminal is dealing with a similar spike in Russian passengers. Dmitry is on the only feasible route from Russia to France.
I was starting to get a little bit worried due to the legislations, and I thought that it's better not to risk.
The risk also too high for political activist Elena Shendera. This anti-war protest in St. Petersburg, stifled by authorities, was what clinched it for her, with demonstrators jailed for days. I can never go back, she says, certain she'd be swiftly detained. It's not only Russians arriving. Each ferry docking in Finland from Estonia carries more and more Ukrainian refugees. A days-long 1,400-kilometer journey into the unknown. This bus was chartered by volunteers who paid 10,000 euros out of pocket to drive to the Ukraine border and pick up refugees.
During our journey, we read news and be in touch with our families. And for now, for us, it's very comfortable, not like there.
She's grateful, but doesn't want to stay in Finland. All she wants is to return home.
And so each day in a new world filled with uncertainty. Railway officials here don't expect much of a drop in the number of passengers heading to Finland from the east. They're negotiating for more trains to accommodate the demand. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Helsinki.
Canada is sending Ukraine another $50 million worth of lethal and non-lethal military equipment.
We will continue to stand up and support in every way we possibly can.
So that equipment includes Canadian-made cameras for surveillance drones. In addition, Trudeau says he has invited Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to address Canadian Parliament, and he says Zelensky has agreed. So that comes on the heels of Zelensky's address to the British House of Commons this week.
Let's turn now to another big story affecting millions of people here at home. This week marks 2 years since the COVID-19 pandemic was declared. 2 years of healthcare mandates, restrictions, and changing how we live to stay safe. Tonight, a change back is on the way in Canada's biggest province. Ontario outlined a plan to drop all pandemic restrictions soon. As Ellen Morrow shows us, the plan is getting mixed reaction.
At this Toronto hair salon, an end to mask mandates won't mean the end of masking. Clients will choose for themselves, but staff will keep wearing them for now.
As numbers progressively go down, maybe we'll feel a little bit more safer about not wearing masks then.
Ontario will drop mask mandates in most settings, including schools, on March 21st, just after the March break. All other public health measures will be gone, says the province, by the end of April.
We are now learning to live with and manage COVID-19 for the long term.
Ontario's top doctor, Kieran Moore, cited high vaccination rates and natural immunity. Still, when asked, Moore said he'll keep wearing a mask in busy malls and stores.
Removing the mask mandate does not mean the risk is gone.
And that risk is still too high, say critics of the province's move.
Personally, I would keep the masks on, at least for the time being, and reevaluate this week by week.
By dropping everything like this, we are putting enormous numbers of people at risk, and the government doesn't seem to appreciate that.
One at-risk group, the immunocompromised. Derek Clark had a double lung transplant 3 years ago.
We feel left out, forgotten, and quite frankly, not listened to.
There are concerns, too, for kids who have lagging vaccination rates. The CEO of Sick Kids Hospital criticized the end of masking in schools, writing in a statement, "As a pediatrician, I encourage families who are more comfortable wearing masks to continue to do so." Still, Premier Doug Ford insists his government is being cautious.
If you want to keep your mask on, keep it on. If you want to take it off. But we have to move forward from this.
Ontario follows Alberta and Saskatchewan in ending mask mandates, but Dr. Moore warned they could come back if cases spike again. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
2 months ago, we told you about the first ever human recipient of a pig heart. It was a stunning medical first, the transplant done as a last resort for an American who was running out of options. We've since learned that man has now died. David Bennett was 57 years old. Surgeons in Maryland genetically altered the pig so Bennett's body would accept the organ. The exact cause of death is unknown. Well, CBC News has learned there are multiple investigations looking into allegations of racism within Canada's Immigration Department. It comes after a report was released last fall detailing multiple instances of racism from employees. Rafi Boudjikanian spoke to one civil servant who says the allegations are nothing new.
How long ago? I started working at the IRCC in the fall of 2017.
The allegations of systemic racism come as little surprise to this federal civil servant. We've agreed to conceal her identity and use someone else's voice because she fears reprisals at work.
A lot of stereotyping going on.
She witnessed it working at the agency's Montreal call center, where some staff often derided immigration applicants.
You know, people from this country, people from that country, they're all liars.
She also says staff were overworked with too many calls, managers even sending employees emails if they deemed their breaks were too long.
Am I supposed to ask like I'm in a kindergarten? Raise my hand and say, "Ma'am, can I please go to the bathroom?"
And the union says there was little help for employees after the fall of Kabul to the Taliban last summer and Canada's promise to bring in 40,000 Afghans.
You know, you could be on the phone and you could hear someone telling you about a sibling being beheaded or a relative that had been raped. They need a moment to reflect and to try and, put themselves in a space mentally where they're able to get on the next call.
CBC News has confirmed an external audit of that call center is now underway, while the union says there are 2 ongoing internal investigations into systemic racism. An anti-racism task force was created by Immigration Canada after George Floyd's killing in May 2020, but its director wouldn't answer specifics about any of the allegations.
So we think that it's important to equip our leaders with anti-racism knowledge, anti-oppression knowledge.
But the union isn't waiting for the results of the 3 investigations. It says it's filing a grievance about workplace discrimination and harassment on behalf of all its members at Immigration Canada. Rafi Boudjikanian, CBC News, Ottawa.
The partner of the gunman who killed 22 people in Nova Scotia in 2020 will testify at the public inquiry into those shootings. Lisa Banfield was the gunman's first victim. He assaulted her, shot at her, and confined her before going on a rampage. Some officers who responded to the shootings will also testify. Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown has settled his $8 million defamation lawsuit against CTV News.
I'm very happy that this is behind me, and I'm looking forward to the future.
Brown stepped down from the leadership of Ontario's Progressive Conservatives in 2018, shortly after CTV broadcast a story alleging sexual improprieties with 2 women. In the settlement, CTV says it regrets the story, adding it contained factually incorrect information. Brown has said he is mulling a bid to run for the leadership of the federal Conservative Party. Well, Canadians are feeling the pressure of rising prices.
He's paying $1,000 more rent than me for the same thing.
Up next, a Fifth Estate investigation into rising rental prices. And a little later, beneath the Antarctic ice, a piece of history frozen in time.
The state of preservation is just something unbelievable. You can see the paintwork on it, the black and white paint.
Coming up, the deep sea discovery and the incredible story of survival behind it.
And I'll be back from Lviv, Ukraine, with information under assault and sanctions clamping down. The view from Russia.
I think the vast majority of Russians probably don't even realize how bad it's going to get.
My conversation with a CBC correspondent who has spent years in the country. We're back in 2.
I don't think that this decision reflects Canadian values. I don't think it reflects Canadian public opinion.
Jaskirat Singh Sidhu's request to stay in Canada has been rejected by the Canada Border Services Agency. The man who caused the Humboldt Broncos bus crash in 2018 is fighting deportation to India after serving his 8-year prison sentence. Sidhu will still try to make his case at a hearing with Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board. Canadians are being priced out from the grocery store to the gas pump. And in real estate, it's not just the price of buying that's squeezing Canadians, it is the price of renting as well. Our colleagues at the Fifth Estate have been looking into Canada's rental crisis. Here's Shayna Luck.
When I moved in here, it was $7.15 a month, all inclusive.
Kevin O'Toole has been living in a Hamilton high-rise for the last 12 years. He's a pensioner and works part-time at McDonald's. His rent has gone up to $825, but it's nothing in comparison to his next-door neighbor.
He's paying $1,000 more rent than me for the same thing.
There's no limit to how much more a landlord can charge once a tenant moves out. Michael Brooks, the CEO of a landlord industry association, argues the rent increases because of upgrades to buildings that have run down.
This is like an old house. It's the same analogy. At some point in time, you need to do a lot of upgrades to modernize that house. That's really expensive.
Martine August studies large companies that buy old buildings, then increase rents.
Repairs and renovations actually make money for firms. And they invest in them because they can extract higher rents afterwards.
The Fifth Estate calculated the profits for 4 top real estate investment companies in Canada. Between 2015 and 2020, that was more than $2 billion. The federal housing minister wouldn't talk to us, but at a February housing conference, he signaled changes are coming for investors in a type of real estate company called REITs, which are among the biggest landlords in Canada. But he didn't say exactly what would change.
We need to take more action against the REITs and making sure that that we're not losing the homes that are affordable to working class Canadians.
Minister Hussein didn't answer our questions about how many affordable units have been built under their government's 5-year-old national housing strategy, or what the rent in those units is. Kevin's landlord is applying for another rent hike to cover the cost of more renovations.
I'm not moving out of here. I will fight them tooth and nail. If I have to go by myself, I am not letting them get away with it.
Shayna Luck, CBC News, Hamilton.
And you can see the full Fifth Estate investigation tomorrow night at 9:30 in Newfoundland on CBC Television and CBC Gem.
So let's take a look at Kyiv tonight, Ukraine's capital on edge with Russia's troops poised to move on it any day now. Russia has been hit with some crushing sanctions for all this, but how is that really playing out inside the country?
What they're telling me is that they're already rationing some commodities in stores, things such as sugar.
Coming up, my conversation with longtime correspondent Chris Brown.
Plus, another longtime CBC foreign correspondent, Brian Stewart, brings his insights into the war so far.
Devastating scenes in Mariupol where Ukraine says Russian bombardments hit a maternity and a children's hospital. Elsewhere in the besieged city, workers are burying scores of the dead in a mass grave. The city, this country, in the deep grip of grief and disbelief. As we watch Ukraine try to hang on, you have to also wonder about the destiny of Russia. By launching this invasion, what has Vladimir Putin unleashed on his own people? What sort of Russia will be left for them while he plots the devastation of Ukraine? The national anthem of Ukraine outside Lviv's Opera House. Hard to imagine the seeming serenity crushed by war. Maybe that's what residents of Kyiv thought not long ago. This destabilizing moment needs insight. So I sat down with the CBC's Chris Brown, who was posted in Moscow for years, to talk of a Russia he knows well. I have so many questions for you. One of them is, today the stock market was supposed to open in Russia. It did not. Again, from the outside, it looks like these sanctions are having an effect. What's your read of it?
I think it's catastrophic already for Russia's middle class especially, and I think the vast majority of Russians probably don't even realize how bad it's going to get, because practically every economic sector of the country is affected. We've already seen young, smart, ambitious Russians voting with their feet and leaving. Countries next door like Georgia are saying they've already had 25,000 Russians come to their country. So this is going to pose an immense long-term economic challenge for this country when all of your best and brightest are simply leaving.
And I know you still have a lot of friends and a lot of contacts inside Russia. On a micro level, on a personal level, what does it look like?
What they're telling me is that they're already rationing some commodities in stores, things such as sugar. We know the fast food giants, McDonald's, KFC, they've all announced they're pulling out. Well, but you have to remember that Russia's security services don't care about hamburgers and French fries, right? They have their own job to do.
Do they care about the protests, though?
Not yet, and it's going to take a lot in order for them to care. Vladimir Putin has spent 20 years almost coup-proofing himself against street protests. We've seen some very, very brave Russians take to the streets since the invasion on February 25th. Something like 13,000 arrests. We've never seen that before, but it's just not enough. You need an awful lot of people, 1 million people or more in the streets, in order to, I think, to really make the Kremlin fearful.
And what about Putin, though? I mean, has he changed at all? Was he always like this? Did something happen?
The conventional wisdom about Vladimir Putin was that he almost made this bargain with Russians 20 years ago, and certainly the oligarchs bought into it. I'm going to let you do what you want. You can have all your fast food stores, take trips overseas, have all your luxury brands, but you leave the politics to me. And if you agree to that, I'll ensure that your standard of living continues to go up. And by and large, until 2014, until he took over Crimea, that was the case. But that's not the case now. So things have changed, obviously.
But why the change, do you think?
All we can tell is what we see on TV. And these images of Vladimir Putin alone, an old man in a bunker with these massive tables, greeting heads of state, even greeting the people that are running his country. All these people are sitting at the far end of the table. He's a man who's alone and clearly not particularly trusting even of his closest advisors. And only a few people have his ear, and those would be the military, people who launched the campaign against Ukraine, and the security services.
Chris, I always appreciate your reporting, your analysis. I know it's hard having lived there, now being here. We'll keep going.
It's good to talk to you, Adrienne.
And of course, Andrew, on top of all the worries Chris mentioned there, chief among them, of course, what on earth is going to happen next here in Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. And on that point, earlier I spoke with former longtime CBC News foreign correspondent Brian Stewart about the war and where it may be headed. So Brian, you have been watching the situation unfold there. What do you make of the speed at which things have been going on in the ground there?
Well, for the Russians, they've been going very poorly in the north and a little better in the east and then fairly well in the south. But basically, it's a sign of a campaign that basically started with the wrong war plan, had no backup, and had the wrong supply chain set up to sustain it. So they've been very surprised and shocked, the Russians, by a campaign, by a resistance that is far more tenacious than they ever expected. They were really thinking Ukraine would cave in about 2 or 3 days. When it didn't cave, it changed the whole nature of the war. They did not start with a shock and awe the way the Americans have in past wars. There was little shock and no awe from the Ukrainians for sure. because they were expecting the Ukrainian government to give in, and they were expecting the command and control centers to order their people to surrender. Therefore, they didn't hammer them on the first day, and they're still functioning.
And to that point, Brian, I mean, Ukraine has a much more robust military capacity than I think a lot of outsiders would give them credit for. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, we watch the maps. It looks like the Russians are advancing and being resisted by a kind of glob of nothing that's there, but they're running into these globs of resistance. In actual fact, Ukraine is one of the largest militaries in Europe. In fact, it's the second largest west of the Russian border. It has a professional, well-armed, in many areas, very well-trained military. It has really now under arms and uniform somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000. That could easily go up to 700,000 or 800,000. And, you know, we forget that Ukraine was just 10 years ago the fourth largest arms manufacturer, exporter in the world. It has 130 various factories that are turning out arms, quite apart from the arms they're getting from the outside world.
And so what is all that? I mean, you know, the manpower, the training, the weaponry, what does it all indicate to you about the possible course of the conflict?
Well, the problem for the Russians here is they've taken on a hornet's nest of powerful military response that has trained for 8 years now, exactly for this kind of invasion. They have excellent intelligence, which is so important in modern war. They have trained in their own backyard, just basically year after year after year. Their major cities are prepared to be turned into fortresses like small Stalingrads. And there's a huge country out there, the west of Ukraine, that is still very large. And they have many, many, many units with armor, tanks, anti-aircraft, missiles of every description, from shoulder fire to emplaced, and basically a lot of armor. But they've built their defense around these smaller territorial units, which are perfect for this war, firing shoulder-fired anti-tank or anti-aircraft missiles. They can move very freely. The officer corps is very well trained, up to the best standards of NATO. So Russia, no matter which way they look at it, has a horrible problem ahead, trying to reduce this large force in any kind of appreciable time. While outside, of course, the economic war is having a backbreaking effect on them in the economy.
Brian Stewart, former longtime foreign correspondent for CBC News. Wonderful to chat with you. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Now, for Ukrainian Canadians, watching the war from afar can be agonizing.
To not be able to be sure that your family is safe. That's what you're thinking about 24/7.
Coming up, the fears of a community brought together over coffee. Welcome back. 1.4 million people in Canada claim Ukrainian heritage. It is a community that has been deeply affected by this crisis. We wanted to know in what ways. So we asked 3 members of the community to meet at a Toronto hub of Ukrainian culture. It's called Future Bakery. They came together as strangers to each other, though what's happening in Ukraine binds them like family. Boris, can I ask you a simple question that is not a simple question? How are you?
We don't have time to think about how we are. We are all preoccupied with worry, and we've all gotten busy helping our family and friends in Ukraine. It's horrific what's happening. Every day we have very difficult conversations. You know, all of us in the Ukrainian-Canadian community are not just connected to family and friends in Ukraine, but it's generational.
Anastasia, if you think back, do you remember a day or a moment where everything, all of your worlds just started to collide? You started to realize that everything's changed?
Yeah, for sure. It was the first night of the attack, so last week. I opened Twitter, I couldn't sleep. And there was just one tweet that, you know, there was something happening in eastern Ukraine, didn't really think anything of it. And then in the span of like 3 seconds, it was just hundreds of tweets with hashtag Ukraine or hashtag Eastern Ukraine, just flooding in. Like, you know, when Twitter updates and it's just like one after the other, that air raids are there and people need to seek shelter. And it was just the most surreal moment, because in that moment, like, you know that everything's changed.
And Valerie, what have the last couple of weeks been like for you?
Well, it's been strange to not be able to be sure that your family is safe. For example, you know, it's that's what you're thinking about 24/7. You know, even have like a roll call that we do at top of day and end of day, that we check the situation of how different regions are doing in our family chat, for example. And you know, in the middle of the night, you know, you wake up and you check how things are doing just to make sure that everyone's all right. I even have an alarm that goes off every 2 hours at night so that I can open my phone and make sure that I don't miss anything important from my family on the ground.
I think the checking of the phone is something that everyone in the community is doing right now. Like, you wake up in the middle of the night, first thing you do is check news alert, Twitter, like a text message, just because you're so worried, and it doesn't matter if it's day or night, it's always on your mind, no matter what you're doing.
I see you both nodding. You're just all checking your phones constantly?
I, in fact, have 2 phones, my regular phone and a secure phone. And I make sure that in the secure phone that should a family member be arrested or killed, and if someone has access to that phone, they won't be able to trace other family members or trace it back.
What is your worst fear?
I have family, I have friends in Ukraine. If anything were to happen to them, that would just be, you know, worst case scenario. But then on a grander scheme, if Putin takes over Ukraine, he's taking over an independent country. We have our own language, we have our own culture, we have our own history. And if he were to take over, he would just be trying to erase all of that.
Valerie, can I ask you, I mean, I've only known you for 20 minutes or so, and yet, you know, I can tell this about you, that there is a seriousness to you, but whenever you speak, I also see a glimmer of a smile, and I don't know where that comes from in a time like this.
Well, I think what's part of our culture is to find also something light, you know, something bright that will give you this urge and motivation to continue going forward. You know, what
He's an Odessit.
I'm from Odessa. Odessa is considered to be the capital of humor. You know, we're like, it's this culture of happy-go-lucky people that are always able to find something to laugh about, even in the worst situation possible. To me, February 24th is like, you know, that moment on 9/11 when all of us knew where we were exactly the moment it happened. The first few days, you know, you're sort of in this, I felt like I was in a fog, for example, and so did a lot of my family members. But however, once a few days have passed and you sort of get the handle of what's going on and you start to understand what's going on, that's when humor starts to kick in, and that's when you're starting to come up with ways to sort of mobilize yourselves through this optimism of that this will be over soon.
Boris, Anastasia, Valerie, everything you have said today, thoughtful and important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so, Adrienne, you know, I ended up speaking a bit more with Boris, that's the owner of the bakery, afterwards. And he told me that that bakery has been vandalized 6 times since Russian troops initially started massing outside Ukraine's borders. Graffiti in both English and Russian. The latest act just 3 days ago. Boris tells me they still haven't caught those responsible, but that every time they deface or slash his signs, he just fixes them, puts them back up.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely sort of the fierce resolve you keep seeing in many places here as people keep, you know, banding together to simply save their country. We know more than 2 million people have been forced to flee Ukraine since the war began, and so many of them are kids.
We're feeling fine at the moment, although we're like in a state of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, and it's quite disturbing for us.
Coming up a little later, the uncertain future many of those children now face.
But first, a historic discovery deep below the Antarctic ice. That's coming up next. Welcome back. Lost for more than a century underwater, one of the world's most famous shipwrecks has been found. And as Justin Hayward shows us, it is in surprisingly good shape.
A century-old ship living up to its name. The Endurance on the ocean floor since 1915. The captain's wheel intact and standing. The portholes still closed. A few scattered dishes from the crew's final meals on board still visible on deck. This maritime archaeologist has never seen anything like it.
The state of preservation is just something unbelievable. You can see the paintwork on it, the black, the white paint. You can count the ship's fastenings and the woodwork. And as you've seen in the illustrations, the ship's wheel is just, it's as if they left it yesterday.
The three-masted ship was caught in Antarctic ice in the summer of 1915. Sir Ernest Shackleton was attempting an expedition to the South Pole. The trapped ship was slowly crushed, finally sinking beneath the ice. All incredibly documented by the expedition's photographer. Stranded on the ice floe, the 28-man crew lived off seals and penguins. Finally trekking and rowing their way to safety months later, the entire crew survived. Fast forward to today. For 2 weeks, a team of scientists and technicians searched for the wreck. Piloting a submersible drone under the Antarctic ice, the expedition found the Endurance just 6 kilometers from the position its navigator recorded a century ago as it sank.
Just as the way that the wreck of the Titanic takes you back to that Edwardian world, just as the way that Pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb excited generations about ancient Egyptian history, or the discovery of Pompeii made us obsessed with the Roman world. I think this wreck is going to perform that role for young people.
Under an international Antarctic treaty, the wreck is now a protected historical monument, meaning the ship will not be raised, nothing will be removed. Researchers will only use detailed scans and images like these to tell Endurance's story. Justin Hayward, CBC News, Montreal.
When we come back, the kids making the long trip out of Ukraine.
We're feeling fine at the moment, although we're like in a state of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow.
Stories of resilience and uncertainty in our moment.
More than 2 million people have now fled the war in Ukraine, and among them, so many children. Behind each young face, a story to tell. Take this 11-year-old who made the journey to Slovakia by himself. His mother stayed behind to look after her own ailing mother. He arrived with a phone number for his relatives written on his hand, and incredibly, this is not the first time in his short life he's fled war. His name is Hassan, and when he was a baby, his family fled Syria.
Of course, there are so many children making the journey out of Ukraine. In tonight's moment, hear directly from two teenagers who have called Kiev home all their lives until now.
I quickly packed my things and I was just sitting in my bathroom because I just wanted the explosions to stop, and they didn't.
Max Taranits and Polina Shostak have both taken refuge in eastern Hungary. Like so many, their families are split. They're traveling with their mothers. Men of fighting age, not allowed to leave.
Our family had to leave, like most of our members, behind in Ukraine. And my mom and I first came to Lviv. We stayed there for a couple of days and then went to Hungary.
Just two of the more than 1 million children forced out of their homes. Uncertainty plaguing their families, friendships, and futures.
We don't go to schools right now. We don't really know how we're going to go to the universities later.
But like so many young voices in the middle of this unfolding tragedy, they are resilient.
We're feeling fine at the moment, although we're like in a state of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, and it's quite disturbing for us.
So no one obviously knows what's going to happen. When they say they're feeling fine, in part that's because of the foresight of Max's mom, who bought that apartment in Hungary back in 2014 after the first invasion, just in case.
And you know, they see this fleeing of Ukraine as temporary. They do say they want to study abroad, but they're already thinking very much about the day that they can return home to Ukraine. That's the National for this March 9th. Have a great night.